In this video about how four-cycle engines work, let me show you this little failed attempt here. I'll just insert this, even though it's not relevant probably, but you might find it of some interest, and I'll have a question for you here to see if you can answer it. But I bought this little engine for $1 just for the purposes of this video, and the magneto was gone, the flywheel's gone and all of that, and I didn't care because I'm not really interested in that. And I knew the thing didn't have much compression, but I thought perhaps a valve was stuck, so I took it apart and took the head off. So see if you out there, especially boys, now you older men are going to know what the problem is here, but as I turn the shaft over, the crankshaft, notice that the valves are operating up and down just fine, but no movement of the piston. And here is the question, without opening the case, what is wrong with this engine? What caused it to fail? This is an easy one. I'll give you just a second to ponder that, and then I'll take the case apart. I think this is a Clinton, and it's built just so totally different, and there you can see the timing gear and the valve springs and so on. And I've taken the bolts off, and this appears to be an aluminum cover, and let me see if it'll knock off easily. Now, I don't care if I damage anything because this is strictly scrap. I'll do that off camera because naturally it's a little harder than I anticipated. Now, did you guess what's wrong with the engine? So the cover is off, and it's just a little difficult to slide off of the crankshaft there because of the corrosion. And that's a zinc die casting, it's not aluminum. So I can't use that in my foundry, but looking inside, and this engine is quite a bit different from a Briggs and Stratton, but what did you guess? Did you guess a broken connecting rod? And then if you did, you were right, because there, you're not going to be able to see it probably, but down in there is the broken connecting rod. And let me take it apart just a little more and see if we got some parts down in there. Well, what do we got here? There's a bolt. There it is. Let me pull it out of there. It's still pretty oily in there, even though I drained out most of the oil. Here's the parts I was able to recover from the connecting rod. The biggest part with the oil dipper on it is jammed in there, and I can't get that out without disassembling the bottom half. But there's the bearings, what's left of them, and they've been all hammered and out misshapen. And there's one of the bolts. I believe this is part of the governor that got broken off in the process. And that might have happened 50 years ago. Now on with the show here and the Briggs and Stratton engine, where I'll actually show how a four-cycle engine operates, what the different strokes are, different in the cycle. This Briggs and Stratton Model N, as in nut, is the engine that I'm going to use now. So I'm getting back to the subject at hand here to show you the cycles. But it's all cast iron except for either zinc or aluminum base and a zinc carburetor and things like that. But even a cast iron head. This is not going to be an easy one. I'd like to cut it away so that you can see all the parts, and that's why I wanted to work on that Clinton engine that had a side cover. And some of the more modern Briggs has side covers, but I don't have one of those, so I'm going to go at this. But this is an air-cooled engine. You can always tell by the fins. Gas tank is long missing. The magneto will be under here, under the flywheel cover here. There's a carburetor. Even has a fuel bowl, cinnamon bowl. Rope start. This is probably from the late 40s or up to the mid 50s. Pretty crude by today's standards. It's probably only a 3/4 horse. It wouldn't be very much, and these were commonly used on lawnmowers. This boss here would have been used on some models that had a lever start or a kick start. And I would bet a month's pension check that there's not a single part on here that's made in another country. Where's my flag? Probably couldn't say that about a new Briggs. I'll start by taking the head off. I made many cutaway models over the years because I was the shop teacher and I had the metalworking equipment, and usually the auto teachers or small engine men were my buddies. So I would do that work, and then when they knocked down the one building, I had a beautiful Wisconsin engine that I had cut apart, and that disappeared. And then later, a couple of years later, they got a new teacher in there teaching. He was only there for a couple of years, and I made him a beautiful Clinton engine cutaway, and it was my engine on top of it, and I put a lot of extra work on it, and he was only there 2 years, and they fired him. And then I thought, well, I'll go in there and get my engine. It belongs to me. Nope, he took it with him. So the head is loose, and it'll come right off. Cast iron. See the spark plug. Place for the valves. Quite a bit of carbon on there. Head gasket, and looking at it from here, you can see that looks like about a 2-inch piston, and you can see the valves are moving, piston's going up and down, so this is going to serve my purpose. And I've already loosened, look at the stuff in there. And that guard, of course, serves to move the air. This is air cooled, and here's the fins on the flywheel, and that would force the air up through here to cool it. There's the coil. Boy, what a big coil they use and all of that. Now it's all a tiny little unit. There'd be the points and condenser are underneath the flywheel, which for now I may not take off. I'm going to clean this off a little bit better, and I think I'll take the carburetor off just so it's out of the way. Now the carburetor butterfly here is connected by, there's a spring there to pull it back, and a little linkage, and this is the governor. Wind vane governor, I think is what they call it. So as the engine slows down, there isn't as much air blowing on it, and it will speed up the engine by turning the throttle. Great simplicity. Tecumseh used one that was inside of the engine, a different kind of governor, but this was a vane governor. You see there's a lot of fins here, and this is, of course, zinc, because they wanted a lot of weight. Some earlier ones were cast iron, but then a lot of them were zinc. And you know what? There's a broken off fin, which means that somebody was in there holding it with a screwdriver trying to get it off, and they didn't have the right tools, they didn't know what they're doing, and they had no idea how brittle zinc was. And can you see that there's a couple of bent ones there? And see if we can see the magnets. There's the magnets cast right into the zinc. Am I telling you too much? Because the purpose of this video is supposed to be just the cycles. And when the magnets go around under the coil, of course, it induces a current. And this is the cup for the rope start. No recoil start available yet at that time. If the hammer and chisel mechanic that broke off this fin so many years ago and threw the engine out of balance had known what he was doing, he would have used a genuine Briggs & Stratton flywheel wrench. And this is what it is, and it will hold the flywheel by at least 2 fins while you loosen this nut, and it'll avoid breaking that, especially if you use an impact, you know, which tends to just pop it off without excessive external force, which might break one of these. So that's a flywheel wrench, and that's a Briggs & Stratton part. I got a lot of the old tools from auctions, And then I took off the carburetor already. You know, nobody uses a float carburetor like that anymore. That would cost $200 to build probably. I took off the cover right here, and this shows the valve springs. Let me get a close-up of that, perhaps would help. Am I showing you too much? I'm glad I got a captive audience. And this spring, I believe, is part of the crankcase ventilation. But those are the two springs that hold the valves shut. I have removed the oil. There still was dirty oil in there, so I took the oil out. But it'll still be a heck of a mess if I take that bottom part off, which I am going to take off, actually. Looking on this side, this is where you add the oil. I took that bolt out, and of course you drain it down here, and I already have. And in fact, I put some thinner in there a while ago and sloshed it around. Hopefully it won't be as messy in there as it could be. And then on the other side, there also was a bolt. So there's really just two bolts holding this cast bottom on here. Let's see if it pops off. Well, it doesn't. It literally almost fell off. Let's see. There we go. Wow, fairly clean in there because, well, you can see the thinner. I'm glad I did that. And this is zinc, not aluminum, so I can't use that in my foundry. Notice the alignment dowel. There's one is stuck in here, the other one's still over here. And you can see the bottom end of the engine now. You can see. Let me zoom in just a little bit. Hey, if you got any boys in the house, have them look at this video, you know, especially if they're young enough where they haven't discovered girls and they haven't discovered cell phones and all that other nonsense. And maybe you can get them interested in something like this. It would be neat. But here we go. That's the oil dipper that splashes the oil. That's the lubrication system where that other engine, that Clinton, had a oil pump, and a lot of the Tecumsehs did too. And there's the camshaft down there. Crankshaft, bottom end of the connecting rod. Gasket, of course there were gaskets. I'm never going to put this back together, so I don't care if I... Generally you can't reuse a gasket anyway, you need to get new ones. I believe I will take the flywheel off if I can get it off. Alright, I am going to use the wrench, so there it is in the fins, 3/4 socket. I've already loosened it up, and you know, now I was just contemplating what happened, you know, years and years ago, and you say, Mr. Pete, you're turning that the wrong way, you're tightening it. No, I'm not. That's a left-hand nut, and that might very well be the reason that he couldn't get it apart or broke the fin. This is a left-hand nut, at least on this model, and there's the cup, the rope cup. Boy, how many times I whipped myself with a rope with these cantankerous old engines, because by the time we got these engines when we were boys, they were worn out, or certainly nobody would have taken them off the lawnmower, because power lawnmowers were still a rarity when I was a boy. We had a hand mower until I was 16 and old enough to buy my own used mower to cut grass with. My dad never owned one. Who cares, you're thinking. Now, how do you get the flywheel off? Because that's held quite firmly onto the taper. So let's think about that. I must own 30 different pullers of various sizes and types, and you've seen me use them in some of the other videos. I got one that weighs 50 pounds. I also have several made by Briggs & Stratton and other small engine companies, but they involve screwing them into some tapped holes on the flywheels that they did in later models, so I don't have that here. So I'm using my Proto puller, which has always been one of my favorites. In fact, I love Proto tools and their predecessor Plum. So I've got these jaws behind the flywheel, but there isn't any room back there because of this zinc backing plate. So if this fails, I will put a clamp across here and try to pull those together. But there is a center hole in the end of the shaft, so that's where the screw is. And what I like to do is draw it up good and tight with a wrench and then smack it smartly to see if it'll pop off. Remember, this flywheel probably hasn't been off since Harry Truman was in office. Well, if I would have had the camera running, you would have heard a loud explosion. And what happened here, and it's loose, I had this on, and I thought, well, since I'm a man that wears suspenders and a belt, I'll go ahead and pull this up with this Jorgensen clamp, and I did. But by tightening this clamp, the orange clamp, and these are a bit wedge-shaped, it popped loose without me even touching this. So, how fortuitous was that? I have seen more engines, and other things for that matter, ruined by people disassembling them than Carter has pills. So off that comes. Boy, that's a heavy flywheel. All zinc. I don't see the balance marks. And here we have a very steep taper with a keyway, and the key, well, I suppose it ended up on the floor. No, here it is. And by the way, you know, the whole war was lost because a horse lost its shoe. Did you ever hear that poem? But anyway, this little aluminum or zinc key, sometimes when an engine backfires or on a rotary mower would hit a rock or something like that, it shears or partially shears that key. But generally just partially, enough to throw the timing off by 1 or 2 degrees, and then the engine won't start. And engines by the thousands, lawnmowers by the thousands are thrown away. And I had a friend who every morning on the way to school would go through the Aurora suburbs and pick up Craftsman mowers that were put out in the garbage that were relatively new, and all they needed was that key, and we would do that in the school. But the man did everything for profit. Of course, he resold them then. Now the ignition is underneath this cover. This is going to be a long video. I didn't mean for it to be long. I removed the 2 screws in this cover, which is steel, not aluminum. The later ones were aluminum. And there's the condenser, which is a capacitor, and the points. Later models incorporated all into one. And let's see, right in here, there's a little plunger. And as the shaft turns, there's a little bit of a flat spot, and that will open and close. I can't get a lever. It open and close the points. But the problem with these older engines is that in order to check the points in condenser and ignition, you had to take the flywheel off. That was most difficult for boys or homeowners who didn't understand or have the right tools. If you just had a crescent wrench and a screwdriver and a pair of pliers, you know, you couldn't go very far with these engines. But that's the ignition coupled with the coil, and quite often the capacitor failed after so many hours, or the points would get dirty, and sometimes the coil failed, but not too often, and that was expensive. The rest was considered consumable and was reasonable price until they discover they can make more money on spare parts than they can on the engines. Just about anything you would ever want to know about Briggs & Stratton engines are in these big parts books, and there's other various manuals and information in here as well. And if you don't have one of those, these are available at just about every box store now, as well as small engine shops. And there's a newer version of this. This is a pretty old one, but this certainly covers everything in regards to servicing Briggs & Stratton engines. So get yourself one of those if you're interested in that. Briggs used to supply the schools with hundreds of these free of charge. Well, about 3 hours has passed, and I've been chopping away at this ever since with my portaband, and it was no small job considering that this is mostly cast iron. And by the way, let me correct myself, if I call this base zinc, it is aluminum. However, the flywheel and the carburetor is zinc. But from what I've done here and what I've cut away, I think you can see more of the parts and help you to understand what we're doing. But let me mention some of the parts that I did not talk about earlier. Most small engines, including this little Briggs, and that's only about a 2-inch piston, and this is an aluminum piston, and it has 3 piston rings. The bottom ring is the oil control ring, and the upper 2 rings are what are called the compression rings. And of course, if the rings wear or the cylinder bore wears, eventually you get poor compression or it burns a lot of oil, or both. This is the crankshaft, and you can see the throw, which has the connecting rod attached to it. And again, the oil dipper or splasher, and that's the connecting rod cap. And on the end of the shaft here, there's a gear, and then there's a larger gear right here that is the camshaft, and it's a 2-to-1 ratio. So this gear has twice as many teeth as this, and the valve timing is determined by how this is assembled, and there are timing marks. I think I'm talking too much about the parts, and in fact what we're interested in here is what makes it run. So the only thing you can't see very well here in this cutaway that I made is the camshaft. So let me take off the bottom part of it just temporarily. This is the crankcase, and you can see that holds quite a bit of oil, probably about 3 pints, and splash lubrication. Let me take that off so we can look at the camshaft. From this bottom view, I think you can see better the camshaft here with its 2 lobes, and it's how it's driven from the crankshaft in a 2-to-1 ratio. And the lobes, as I rotate this, are pushing on the tappets, which in turn push on the valves and open and close the valves. And the camshaft is supported by a bearing here and on the other side, and also lubricated by the crankcase oil. I've also cut a portion of the head away, as you can see. And now we can see both valves. The red, of course, is hot, that's the exhaust valve, and the green is cold, and that's the intake valve. And you can see them open and close as I rotate the crankshaft. Now remember, a 4-cycle engine only has a power stroke every other revolution. A 2-stroke has a power stroke every revolution. So that's how the valves work. You saw the camshaft, and it's just pushing up and opening and closing the valves. Well, the valves actually are closed by the springs, which I showed you a little bit earlier. Finally, after all that preparation, we're to the gist of what this video is about and how does it work. The 4-stroke cycle engine, and this page is taken out of the Briggs & Stratton book. It's an instructional book, and I think they're probably glad that we're using it. But here are the 4 strokes, and on the intake stroke, the piston is going down, and the intake valve is open, and there's a strong vacuum formed, and it's sucking in the mixture of gasoline and air that is coming through the carburetor. And when it comes down to the bottom, we have the compression stroke. The piston starts going back up with both valves closed and compressing that fuel and air mixture. Then, when it comes to the top dead center, we have a spark. Both valves are still closed, and that's the power stroke, the explosion and all of the energy exerted against the piston. And when it comes down to the bottom, our final stroke is the exhaust stroke. the exhaust valve opens, and as the piston goes up, it forces all of the waste gases out of the engine through the muffler. Now let's do the same thing looking at the engine. Here we are over at the engine. Again, it's the 4-stroke cycle. Intake, compression, power, and exhaust. So looking at it right here, the piston is at the top. Both valves are closed. And as the engine is turned, the intake valve opens. You can see it open. So the mixture of gas and air is coming through the carburetor up through here, and a strong vacuum is formed as the piston goes down. Now when it's all the way down, watch, and the green valve will close. Both valves remain closed during, this is the compression stroke, and it's compressing that mixture, and when it gets to the top, the spark plug fires with the spark supplied by the magneto, and again both valves are closed, and the explosion forces the piston down. That's the power stroke. And when it's all the way down, the red valve, the exhaust valve, opens up, and as the piston comes up, it's forcing those exhaust gases out and through the muffler and away from the engine. And that's the 4 cycles. Let's go over it again. Intake, compression, power, exhaust. Now let's go through the 4 cycles again, looking at the valves. Intake, compression, power, exhaust. And now one more time with the head off, where you can see the piston and the valves at the same time. Intake, compression, power, exhaust. Intake, compression, power, exhaust. And that completes this video on how a 4-cycle engine works. Hope you enjoyed this video, and tell your friends about it. This is tubalcain saying so long for now.